I moved into the house about a year ago. It wasn't anything extraordinary, just an old Victorian-style home on the outskirts of town. The price was right, and the location suited my quiet lifestyle. I'd always dreamed of having a place that was a little out of the way, where I could focus on my writing, where the distractions of city life wouldn't get in the way. The house itself was charming, with its creaky wooden floors, ornate windows, and large, open rooms that had the kind of character you only find in houses built a century ago. It wasn't the most modern or sleek, but it had a certain warmth about it, a history. At first, there was nothing that stood out about it. It had the usual quirks of an old house, drafts in the winter, plumbing that sometimes made odd noises, and, of course, the settling sounds of the building every night. I thought nothing of it. It was just a house, nothing to fear. I loved it. It felt like home, the sort of place you could disappear into, retreat from the world, and just breathe. I lived alone, which was exactly how I liked it. I worked from home most of the time, spending my days writing and reading. My schedule was simple, predictable, and for months that was all it was. Simple, predictable, peaceful. The house was perfect for me, and I settled into a comfortable routine. But that all changed the day I found the door. It was a Wednesday, a quiet afternoon like most others. I had decided to do a bit of spring cleaning. Nothing major, just tidying up some of the older rooms that hadn't been touched much since I moved in. The house was large, with several rooms I hadn't used in a while. One room in particular was on the second floor, tucked behind a heavy wooden door that I hadn't thought much of. I had just assumed it was a closet or a storage area. But when I went to open it, the door refused to budge. It wasn't locked, but it seemed stuck. The frame had swollen over the years, and I figured it was just old wood causing the problem. I gave it a firm shove, and it opened with a loud creak. Inside was a small room, tucked away behind the walls of the house. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The walls were lined with dust, and there were cobwebs hanging in every corner. Old, forgotten furniture sat in the middle of the room. An armchair, a table, and an old wooden chest. The air was thick with the musty scent of neglect, and the temperature was noticeably cooler than the rest of the house. At first, I thought it was just another storage room, but as I stepped inside, something felt off. It wasn't the room itself, but the feeling in the air. There was a heaviness in that small space, a kind of presence that I couldn't explain. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stood there, my eyes scanning the dark corners. The room felt like it had been waiting for me, like it had been waiting for someone to find it. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to stay. The light from the hallway spilled into the room, illuminating the dusty furniture. I approached the chest, curious to see what might be inside. I hadn't thought about it much, but it struck me that I'd never seen this room before, not even when I'd first moved in. The house was big, sure, but I should have noticed it. I should have seen the door, the way it had been hidden from view. With a creak, I opened the chest. Inside, there was nothing but a pile of old, yellowed papers wrapped in twine. The paper smelled faintly of mildew, and I hesitated for a moment before lifting it out and unwrapping it. What I found inside were sketches, drawings of the house, of rooms and corridors that didn't exist anymore. The sketches were old, but they seemed meticulously done. There were diagrams of secret passages, hidden staircases, and rooms tucked away in the walls. One drawing caught my eye in particular. It was a rough sketch of a doorway, one that didn't exist in the house anymore. The door was drawn in intricate detail with symbols etched into the frame. Below the sketch, written in faded ink, were words I couldn't quite make out. But there was one word I recognized: shadows. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I looked at the word. Something about it sent a wave of unease through me, and I quickly stuffed the papers back into the chest. My heart was racing. What had I just discovered? And why had this room been hidden away from me? I shut the chest and quickly left the room, locking the door behind me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was somehow different now. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, the air heavier. I went back to my writing desk, trying to ignore the strange feeling that had taken hold of me. But the house felt alive in a way it never had before. And the shadows? They seemed to be waiting for something. The next few days after I found the hidden room were unsettling, to say the least. The weight of what I had uncovered, the chest, the strange sketches, the word shadows, pressed down on me like a storm cloud. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't ignore the feeling that the house was aware of my discovery, that something inside it had shifted. The strangest part was the way the house felt. It was as though it was breathing with me. The creaks of the floorboards seemed louder, the wind through the windows more pronounced, and the shadows. Well, they weren't like they used to be. They lingered longer in the corners of rooms, curling and shifting like they were alive. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, but when I looked directly, there was nothing there. Just the usual shadows. I tried to go back to my normal routine. I worked during the day, mostly ignoring the growing unease that kept me from truly relaxing. But each night, after the sun had set and the house fell into darkness, the weight of it all would return. I could feel something was watching me, something hiding in the walls. A week later, I decided I needed to know more. I couldn't keep ignoring the strange energy in the house, the sense that the hidden room was the epicenter of something much larger. The sketches in the chest hadn't been random. They were deliberate, showing hidden spaces that the house had once contained, secret doors, forgotten hallways, and rooms that had been sealed off for reasons I didn't understand. That evening, I found myself standing at the door to the hidden room again. The house felt colder now, like it had turned its attention on me. I had to know what it was hiding. I had to understand why it had been sealed off for so long. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting the room to feel different. The air was thick, heavy with something that lingered in the space, something that wasn't quite right. The shadows in the room seemed darker, more defined, like they were pulling at the corners of the room, stretching toward me. I stepped inside again, this time determined to find the answers I was searching for. The chest was still in the far corner, but now there was a new feeling in the room, a palpable presence. It wasn't just a space that had been forgotten, it was a space that had been waiting. I went straight to the chest, opened it slowly, and took out the papers once more. This time, I wasn't just curious, I was desperate. I needed to know what was going on. I unfurled the papers and looked at the sketches again, but something was different this time. The drawings were more detailed now, and there were new symbols that I hadn't noticed before. They were etched into the margins, scribbled hastily, as if someone had been trying to warn me. One of the sketches was different from the rest. It depicted the room I was standing in, but it was drawn in a way that made the entire space seem distorted. The walls seemed to curve inward, almost as if they were alive, shifting to trap whatever was inside. As I studied the drawing, I felt a sudden pressure in my chest. It was like the room was closing in on me, the walls tightening, pushing in. The shadows, which had always been quiet and still, now seemed to shift and move. I turned quickly, feeling the heat in the room rise. There was someone standing behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but the room was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, lurking just out of sight. The air grew colder again, and the shadows in the corners seemed to grow longer, twisting into shapes that weren't quite natural. That's when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It was coming from the walls. "We've been waiting for you." I froze. The voice was low, chilling, and echoed in my ears as if the very walls of the house had spoken to me. I backed away, my mind racing. What was happening? What had I found in this house? I had to get out. I had to leave before whatever was inside this place consumed me. But as I turned to leave, I saw something else. Something that stopped me in my tracks. In the reflection of the mirror across the room, I saw a figure standing behind me. It was shadowy, its features indistinct, but there was a presence to it. It was as if the shadow was watching me, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, just as it had been before. I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was still there, standing in the corner, just out of sight. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for certain. The house, the room, the shadows, they weren't just part of the building. They were something else. Something that had been waiting, hidden in the walls, for me to find it. The air in the room grew thick with a cold, unnatural energy, and the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. I could hear faint whispers in the corners of my mind, urging me to stay, to surrender to whatever force had been lurking in the house for so long. But I couldn't. I had to leave. I had to escape before the house consumed me like it had consumed everyone before me. I ran for the door, but as I reached for the handle, I felt something cold fingers brush against my arm. I turned quickly, but the room was empty. The house was silent again, but the shadows, I knew, were still there, waiting. The days after I found the hidden room were a blur. The strange feelings, the whispers, the shadows that moved on their own, all of it had sunk into my mind, gnawing away at my sense of reality. I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest, and it only seemed to grow stronger the more time I spent in the house. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The house was old, after all. The creaks and groans of an ancient structure settling were normal, but this felt different. It wasn't just the usual sounds of an old house. It was as if the house was alive, breathing, watching me. I spent my days trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. I stayed busy, cleaned the house, and tried to focus on my work. But at night, when I was alone in the stillness of the house, the whispers would return. Faint but unmistakable. Sometimes I would hear them in the walls, other times in the corners of my room, almost like the house itself was trying to communicate with me. One night, I was in the kitchen, making dinner, when I heard the sound of something moving in the hallway outside. I froze, the knife still in my hand, listening carefully. The sound was faint but unmistakable. The soft padding of footsteps on the floorboards, slow and deliberate, as if someone were walking toward me. I peered into the hallway, but there was no one there. The house was silent, except for the usual hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the floor beneath me. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just the house settling again. But then the footsteps returned. Closer now. I heard them in the hallway outside the kitchen door. My heart began to race. I walked slowly to the doorway, peeking around the corner into the darkened hallway. There was nothing, no one, but the feeling was still there. I could feel it, the presence, something watching me. I turned back into the kitchen, trying to calm myself, but when I reached for the stove, I noticed something strange. The light above the sink flickered once, then went out completely. The entire kitchen plunged into darkness. I cursed under my breath, fumbling for the light switch, but before I could find it, I heard it again. The soft sound of breathing. Close, too close. It was coming from the doorway. I didn't need to turn around to know I wasn't alone anymore. I backed into the corner, my breath shallow, my pulse pounding in my ears. My heart raced as I reached for the phone on the counter, but the moment I touched it, the breathing stopped. The air grew thick, heavy, like the weight of the room had suddenly increased tenfold. The silence was worse than the footsteps, worse than the breathing. It felt suffocating, like the house itself was closing in on me. The shadows, once quiet, began to shift in the corners of the room, warping and twisting like they had a life of their own. I could feel their pull, like the darkness was reaching out to grab me. I stumbled backward, my hand still gripping the phone, but it felt useless. There was no one I could call, no one who would believe me. I turned and fled into the living room, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But as I sat down on the couch, trying to calm my nerves, I noticed something even more unsettling. The shadows in the corners of the room weren't just moving, they were growing. I had lived in this house for months, and I'd never seen the shadows behave like this. They stretched out, elongating across the walls like they were trying to reach me. The more I watched, the more it felt like they were closing in. Suddenly, I heard a loud thud, like something had fallen upstairs. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat, and then the sound came again. A heavy thud, followed by the sound of something dragging across the floor. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was just the house settling again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was upstairs, moving around in the dark. I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me, and made my way toward the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the air seemed to grow thicker with each movement. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and I could hear the sound of my own breath, ragged and uneven. But it was the silence that followed, the silence that seemed to hang in the air, that made me stop. Something was waiting. I reached the top of the stairs, my hand trembling on the railing, and looked down the hallway. The air here was colder, and the shadows seemed darker. The hallway stretched out before me, leading to the bedrooms, to the place where I'd found that hidden room. I heard it again, the dragging sound, but this time it was louder, closer. It was coming from my bedroom. I moved quickly, my feet carrying me down the hallway before I could even think about it. My pulse was racing, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached my bedroom door and stopped, my hand hovering over the knob. I could feel the coldness in the air around me, the pull of something dark, something ancient. I pushed open the door. Nothing. I stepped inside, scanning the room. The shadows were long and deep, but nothing seemed out of place. My bed was empty. The dresser was still, the drawers closed. There was no sign of anyone or anything being there. But as I turned to leave, I caught sight of something in the corner of the room. The closet door was ajar. I hadn't left it open. I stepped toward it, my hand trembling as I reached for the door, But before I could touch it, I heard it. The whisper, right behind me. "It's too late." I spun around, but there was nothing. The room was still, except for the shadows which seemed to grow darker by the second. I had to leave. I had to get out of this house before whatever was lurking in the darkness consumed me. The night after I had confronted the strange occurrences in the shop, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something much darker than I had ever anticipated. The whispering shadows, the animals acting out in ways I couldn't explain. It was becoming clearer now. The shop wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and the presence that haunted it was something far older than I could comprehend. I needed answers. I had to understand why the shop felt so oppressive, why the animals behaved in such strange ways, and why I was starting to feel like I was being watched. There had to be something buried deep in the shop's history, something that explained all of this. If there was any chance of finding a way out, I had to uncover the secrets it was hiding. The next day, I returned to the back office after Mr. Beckett had left for the afternoon. The heavy air seemed thicker than usual as I walked through the store, the floor creaking under my feet, and the eerie silence pressing in on me. I knew he wasn't fond of visitors in the back room, and I'd never dared to look through his files before, but I had to now. I couldn't afford to remain in the dark any longer. I sat at his desk and flipped through the cluttered papers. Most of it was just routine paperwork, inventory lists, customer receipts, pet supply orders, but there was a folder tucked away at the back, one that caught my eye. It was labeled Private Confidential. My heart raced as I slowly opened the file. Inside were faded records, some of which looked decades old. The first few pages seemed harmless enough, just old pet orders from past customers. But as I dug deeper, I found something disturbing. A series of handwritten notes, dated back to the shop's early days, just after it had opened. The handwriting was frantic, the ink smeared in places as if the person writing was trembling. The first entry made my skin crawl. The animals, they feel it. The energy in the shop, it's changing them. The cats, the birds, they've become restless. They watch me in ways that they didn't before. I hear whispers, faint but insistent, urging me to stay. I could feel a knot forming in my stomach as I read on. I've tried everything. Spraying the cats with water, keeping them in their cages, but nothing works. There's something inside this shop, something ancient. The doors lock, the windows stay shut, but it's like the house itself is trying to speak to me, to take me. The further I read, the more I realized how long this had been going on. This wasn't the first time someone had worked here and experienced something. The journals, the warnings, the feeling of being drawn into something darker. It had all been written down, but no one had ever acted on it. There was a mention of a previous owner, a name that kept popping up throughout the notes, Thaddeus Wren. Wren had owned Paws and Whiskers in the late 1800s, and it seemed that he had been obsessed with animals, particularly the so-called unusual ones. According to the papers, Wren had kept a collection of rare, even exotic creatures that no one else seemed to know much about. Creatures whose names I couldn't even pronounce. The records grew more erratic, and the handwriting became more frenzied. The shadows in the back room. They're moving. It's the cats. They are the key. Wren brought something in. I don't know what it is, but it's here. It's feeding on them. Feeding on the pets. And on me. We are trapped in this place. There is no escape. I stared at the words, heart pounding in my chest. My eyes flicked back to the front of the store. The animals were all still, staring at me from their cages. Were they aware of the history I had just uncovered? Did they know what had been done to them, or to us? I was beginning to understand. The animals weren't just pets. They were part of whatever dark energy had been sealed within the shop. But what exactly was it? And what had Wren unleashed all those years ago? I flipped through more of the pages, the tremble in my fingers growing with each line I read. The pages blurred in front of me. This wasn't just about old records, it was about something else. I found one last note at the end of the file. I don't know if I can stop it anymore. The creatures are no longer just animals. They've become the vessel. The shop is feeding, and the only way to break the curse is to destroy what Wren created, if it's not too late. The words felt like a blow to my chest. Destroy what Wren had created. Could it be that simple? Had he done something so terrible that it had turned this shop into a vessel for something dark and evil? I sat back in the chair, staring at the page. The room felt colder now, the air heavier, as if the shop itself was pushing back against the truth I had uncovered. My hands were shaking as I closed the folder and shoved it back into the drawer. I couldn't sit in that room anymore. I needed to leave, to clear my head. But as I stood and turned to walk out of the office, I felt it. The unmistakable feeling of being watched. I froze, my heart racing. I wasn't alone. I turned back to the door, but before I could reach for the handle, the room grew darker. The shadows along the walls seemed to stretch and twist, moving like living things. The whispers were back, louder now, echoing in my ears, words I couldn't make out but understood. You shouldn't have found out. I turned toward the window and gasped. The animals, they were all staring at me, their eyes glowing in the darkness, as if waiting for something. Or someone. You're ours now. I took a step back, and the floor beneath me creaked in protest. The shop had claimed me. I was just another part of its twisted legacy. The moment the voice whispered those chilling words, I knew I had crossed a line I couldn't come back from. The atmosphere in the shop shifted, turned suffocating, heavy with an oppressive energy that clung to every inch of the room. The shadows that had been so still before now seemed to pulse with life. They were moving, reaching, crawling toward me as if they were extensions of something darker, something that didn't belong in this world. The animals, their eyes, had changed. They were no longer just observing. They were waiting. Their eyes were like black voids, unblinking, unfeeling, and yet they seemed to burn into me with a kind of predatory awareness. The parrot's usual squawks had quieted, replaced by a low, rumbling growl from the ferret's cage. The silence between us stretched thick with unspoken tension, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The door to the back office slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls, trapping me inside. The lights overhead flickered, the buzzing growing louder, like an electric hum that matched the rapid beating of my heart. I rushed toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. It wouldn't budge. The door was locked, but it hadn't been before. My breath quickened. "Let me out!" I shouted, but my voice felt swallowed by the shop, swallowed by the air that felt thick with something far older, something that had been waiting for me all along. I stepped back, panic rising, but as I turned to the front of the store, something caught my eye. The shadows in the corners were moving again, but this time they weren't just creeping, they were shifting, twisting into dark figures that looked almost human, but distorted. Their edges blurred and melded with the air, like smoke rising from the floor. The shapes were impossibly tall, their forms unnatural, like something that didn't belong, something that had crawled into this world from beyond the veil. I could feel them watching, waiting for me to make the next move. No escape. The voice echoed again, but this time, it didn't just come from the walls. It seemed to come from everywhere. I could feel it in my chest, vibrating beneath my skin. My body tensed, and I turned to face the back of the store, my legs moving on their own. I couldn't breathe. The shadows were everywhere now, pushing in on me, surrounding me. The floorboards groaned under the weight of the building, the walls themselves seeming to shudder with a low, guttural sound. I glanced back at the door, but it was no use. I was trapped by something that had been here long before me. Then I saw the cat. The large black cat that had been eerily still in its cage now stood in the center of the room, its fur gleaming under the dim light. Its eyes were glowing, brighter now, like twin orbs of darkness, pulling me in, drawing me closer. I had never seen it move before. It had always just watched me. But now, it was different. It wasn't just a cat anymore. It was something else, something alive in a way I couldn't understand. Its body twitched, its muscles rippling unnaturally as it began to walk toward me. With each step, I felt the pull of the shop grow stronger, the oppressive energy tightening around me as if it were feeding off my fear. The cat didn't make a sound. No purring, no scratching, no chirping, just the soft, measured patting of its paws on the floor. And then it stopped. The cat was no longer just standing still. It was waiting. Its gaze locked onto mine, unblinking. The world around me seemed to slow, the sounds of the shop fading into a low, monotonous hum. My breath caught in my throat as the shadows around it grew deeper, darker, thicker. It was as though they were becoming part of the cat, merging with it, suffusing it with their power. "You belong to us now," the voice said again, and this time it was clearer than ever. It wasn't just the cat. It was the entire shop, the entire building. It was alive. I had unknowingly stepped into its web, and now it was feeding on me. The shadows weren't just watching. They were pulling me toward them, pulling me toward the cat. I stepped back, my legs shaking. The shadows followed, swirling around me, their movement too fluid to be natural. My heart hammered in my chest and my head swam. I could feel the walls pressing in on me, the very air closing around me like a vice. The cat's eyes seemed to grow, filling the room with darkness. It was the gateway, the key, the vessel. I couldn't breathe. "No one ever leaves," the voice whispered. But this time it wasn't coming from anywhere specific. It was inside my mind. The walls, the shadows, the cat. They were all part of it, part of the same thing. I was no longer just a visitor in the shop. I was part of the shop. It had claimed me, and it wasn't going to let me go. The shadows reached for me, pulling at my clothes, brushing against my skin like cold fingers. The cat's glowing eyes were the last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me. The world around me went completely dark, and for a moment, I thought I had lost all sense of time and space. The suffocating pressure of the shop, the weight of the shadows that had followed me, seemed to crush me from all sides. But I wasn't sure if I was still standing or if I had fallen. The air was heavy, thick with the stench of decay and something darker, something ancient. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if the very air was swallowing my voice, silencing me. The shadows, no, the darkness, seemed to coil tighter around me, wrapping around my body like chains. The last thing I remembered was the cat's glowing eyes, locked on mine, before the darkness pulled me deeper, its cold fingers dragging me into its heart. Suddenly, everything changed. I was no longer standing in the pet shop. I was somewhere else, somewhere dark, hollow, and empty. The air was even colder here, biting at my skin. I couldn't see anything, yet I could feel the presence of something else in the room. It wasn't just in the room, it was the room itself. The walls were pulsating, breathing in and out like a living thing. I felt the ground beneath me shift, as though the building was alive, moving. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled forward, reaching out, but there was nothing to grab onto. The shadows had gone, but the weight remained, an overwhelming pressure that suffocated my every thought. And then, in the distance, I heard it. A voice. "You're mine now." I froze. It wasn't the cat's voice this time. It was deeper, darker. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, filling the space, vibrating through my bones. It was ancient, full of power, and it felt like it had been calling to me for far longer than I had realized. "It's too late for you." I felt my body move against my will, as though the force of the voice itself was dragging me forward. I stumbled, unable to stop, my mind racing with thoughts of escape, of breaking free. But I knew that there was no escape. The shop had already claimed me. The dark force within it had already woven its threads into my soul. It had been waiting for me to walk through its door, waiting for me to find that hidden room and awaken what had been buried for so long. As I was pulled forward, the shadows appeared again, but they weren't just shadows. They were figures. Dark, distorted shapes moving in the periphery of my vision. I tried to scream, but again, nothing came out. The voice in my mind spoke again, louder this time, stronger. "The shadows are me. The animals are me. You are me." It hit me all at once, the realization that the shop itself was alive. It wasn't just a building, it was a vessel. The animals, the strange behavior, the whispers, the shadows, they were all part of something ancient, something that had been living in the dark corners of the shop for as long as it had stood. The shop wasn't just feeding on fear, it was feeding on souls, and once you entered, it consumed you, pulling you into its twisted existence. The shadows closed in, surrounding me. The walls of the room seemed to pulse, as if the entire building were breathing with me. I was being consumed, devoured by the darkness that had been waiting for me. I had become just another part of the shop's twisted legacy. But then, something changed. I don't know what it was, some instinct deep inside me or a flicker of hope, but I refused to let it take me. I fought it, pulling myself away from the darkness, even though I could feel it trying to drag me under. I couldn't let the shop win. I couldn't let it consume me like it had consumed everyone else before me. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold surface of the shop. And then I remembered. The journal, the notes from the previous owners, the warnings about the gateway, about how the shop fed on the souls of those who entered. I had to break the cycle. I had to find a way to stop it. "You can't stop it." The voice in my mind was relentless, mocking, but I could. I had to. With everything I had left, I focused on the source of the darkness. The cat, the vessel, the gateway. I thought back to the chest I had found in the hidden room, the way the shop had tried to force me into it. The shop had been feeding, and it would continue to do so unless I destroyed the heart of it. The cat, the vessel, was the key. I turned toward the figure in the distance, my body trembling with fear. The cat was no longer just standing. It was growing, its body expanding, its fur shifting like liquid night, as though it was becoming part of the shadows. Its eyes burned brighter, but I wasn't afraid. I couldn't be afraid anymore. with one final surge of will, I charged toward it, my hands reaching for the creature, for the heart of the shop. I grabbed it with both hands, pulling it into my chest. The world around me shattered. The cat screeched, its form twisting, but as it did, the walls of the shop cracked, splintering apart, the shadows collapsing in on themselves. The floor cracked open beneath me, and I could feel the pressure release like a dam breaking. The air cleared, the oppressive weight lifting. The whispering voices faded. The shop began to crumble around me, its dark influence fading away piece by piece. The darkness was gone. The shop had lost its grip on me. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The air was normal again, clean, fresh. The weight was gone. The shop was no longer alive, and I was free.